Petrified Forests National Park is a diverse area in northeastern Arizona named for its large deposits of petrified wood. How this stuff formed is a pretty complicated process, but I'll do my best to sum it up for you guys. Basically, once upon a time, this landscape consisted of lush forests and waterways. Eventually, when the trees fell, they became buried in sediment along said waterways, and rather than decomposing, the wood absorbed certain sediments. The magical force behind the crystallization of this wood were minerals, and over a process of tens of thousands of years, quartz and crystals replaced the organic wood material. Today, visitors can take a variety of hiking trails past petrified wood, taking in all of its incredible colors. Pretty much all of these examples can be found in the southern part of the park, which is essentially Unit Number 1. Even though Petrified Forest isn't technically divided into districts or units, there are 3 distinct sections that are vastly different from one another, and this is one of them. Alone, the southern part of this national park is home to one of the highest concentrations of petrified wood in the world. In the center of the park, you'll find the Blue Mesa section, home to a display of blue, purple, and gray badlands. Badlands are a type of dry terrain where softer sedimentary rocks and clay-rich soils have been extensively eroded. It often looks very rugged, but the color content you can find in badland scenery is also very impressive. I've seen my fair share of badlands at this point, and I can honestly say that Blue Mesa has some of the most unique colors of any of these locations. The last major portion of the park is the Painted Desert, another much more vast series of badlands. These ones are almost entirely red and are protected within the national park as a national wilderness area. This means motorized travel is limited, and the only way to get an up-close and personal experience with this area is by hiking into it. Now, there's 2 ways you can experience all these things, and that's either driving north to south or south to north. Either entrance is accessed by an exit off a major highway, so even though this park is geographically very remote, it's not that difficult to get to. We began in the north where the Painted Desert section of the park is located. Here, there's a handful of overlooks and short hiking trails that provide unique views of the Badlands. Our first stop in the park was Toponi Point, the first of 8 designated viewpoints in this area. Personally, I wasn't as impressed as I hoped I'd be, as even though the Badlands scenery is very nice, I do think you need to be at a higher elevation to really take it all in. As we'd come to find out, none of these overlooks are all that high, and from my experience in Badlands across the country, the closer you are, the less pronounced the color and vastness of the formations are. That said, I still decided to take this in for what it was, and our next few pull-offs gave us a better understanding of the scenery. One of these was Tawa Point and the Painted Desert Rim Trail, which are both accessed by the same parking lot. I had pretty much the same thoughts about Tawa Point as the last one, but the Rim Trail did give you some faintly different perspectives. This was 1.2 miles out and back to get to overlook number 3, Kachina Point. This was definitely my favorite thus far, as it's more expansive than the past 2, and you are a little bit higher as well. Plus, something I found very cool was the Painted Desert Inn located at this viewpoint. This is a beautiful building constructed in the 1920s, and more than 100 years later, it remains in the park as a small museum. So even though you can no longer stay overnight in it, I thought it looked really cool and culturally unique to this area. After all, Petrified Forest is completely surrounded by the Navajo Nation, the largest Indian reservation in the United States, and all throughout the park are some cool remnants that tribes have left over. Next up was Pintado Point, likely the highest elevated overlook in the area if I had to take a guess. You could see just how much a little height difference enhanced these views, even though it still wasn't that high overall. There's not much to see in the foreground, but out in the distance, there's a massive expanse of painted desert that you could definitely understand how it could be a wilderness area. All these handful of overlooks were certainly the best from what I could tell. We also stopped at Lacey Point, but it wasn't all too special, which is why we decided to skip the other 2 viewpoints located right next door. I did enjoy the Painted Desert, but nothing about it blew me away, and it was without a doubt my least favorite part of the park. It does add some neat diversity though, and that's something I really appreciate. On the stretch of road separating this section with the other 2 down south, you are driving through absolute nothingness. It's a true testament to how middle of nowhere this park feels, until you reach the next spot I'd recommend, which is located right before the Blue Mesa area. Doubling as a state historic monument, Newspaper Rock is one of the largest displays of petroglyphs in the country. Personally, I don't normally find petroglyphs all too interesting, but there were 2 things that made Newspaper Rock stand out. The obvious one being that there were just tons of petroglyphs, but 2, there were free-to-use telescopes that give you a much closer look at the intricate detail. You could clearly depict what a lot of these drawings meant, and deciphering that was quite fascinating to me. But we still didn't take too much time here before heading into the Blue Mesa, which was personally my most anticipated part of the park, even ahead of the Petrified Forest itself. I'd come to find out that these Badlands were not too vast at all, which is a shame because they're absolutely beautiful. In my eyes, they stand out far more than those found in the Painted Desert. Part of the reason is they're shaped more like teepees, so each of the eroded hills were considerably more pronounced, but also the color is unlike any Badlands I've seen in my life. It's called Blue Mesa, but it's honestly far more purple than anything, and that was very unique to me. There's a handful of ways you can experience Blue Mesa, with the most popular being the Blue Mesa Trail that takes you into the main portion of the Badlands. This is a 1-mile loop that I certainly enjoyed, but I'd be much quicker to suggest the Blue Forest Trail. This is a far more dangerous primitive trail that takes you over the Badlands. It's not marked at all, and in most national parks would be completely illegal. But here, it's simply an unknown option that is listed on Petrified Forest website. The hike is 2.4 miles total from the trailhead and begins in an easy-to-miss pull-off along Petrified Forest Road. Or you could do what we did and combine the Blue Mesa and Blue Forest trails. This only adds like half a mile, or nothing at all if you follow our route. It can be a little hard to spot, but at the far northeastern part of the Blue Mesa Trail, there's a small path you can take to get atop the Badlands and connect to the Blue Forest Trail. As I said earlier, the higher you go, the more vivid the colors look, and it doesn't take much elevation change for the hues to stick out like a sore thumb. I was so impressed by the trail because it definitely felt pretty dangerous in some spots, and that's incredibly unusual for a national park. Not only are some sections narrow with steep drop-offs, but the loose gravel makes it a lot harder to get good traction. I say that if you can take this slow, you'll be fine and you shouldn't overthink it. Your effort is well worth the views you get along the way. Eventually, the trail does split off and goes into a small wash beneath the Badlands, which I've heard is kind of meh. Instead, we backtracked the way we came and connected back to the Blue Mesa Trail, where we completed the rest of the loop back to the parking area. I'd also like to shout out the Blue Mesa Overlook just a minute down the road from the trailhead, as this grants you a view of the main section of Blue Mesa and the awesome looking trail snaking its way around the Badlands. Overall, I really enjoyed my time here, and though I wish it were a bit more expansive, the options there were I thought were really nice and gave a good feel for this section of the park. But now it was finally time to experience a namesake of the park, the Petrified Wood. Our next destination was Jasper Forest Overlook. This is a cool spot that combines a little bit of scenery reminiscent of Blue Mesa while looking down at hundreds upon hundreds of pieces of crystallized wood. Obviously, you can't see any of the detail from up here, but it's great to get some perspective as to how much of this stuff there is lying around the park. We experienced 3 short trails taking you through the Petrified Forest, with my absolute favorite being the Crystal Forest Trail. This is a 0.8-mile loop that takes you right up close to these logs, and I was absolutely blown away by the unique colors they had to offer. Some pieces of wood were much more vivid than others, but even the less impressive ones are quite stunning. The most spectacular displays, though, my brother described as full-on galaxies, and I love that description because look at this. Tell me that's not completely accurate. We spent so much time here taking in the sparkly hues of the logs, and I never got tired of this at any point. I really think Petrified Wood is one of the coolest small-scale pieces of nature in a national park, and after seeing it for the first time, I started to wonder why it took me so long to visit one of these forests. At the far south part of the park is where you'll find the park's main visitor center, as well as the next 2 trails that take you past Petrified Wood. Real quick, I do just want to say that it's very cool there's pieces of petrified wood available for purchase here, as all of those were collected outside the park and would have been destroyed anyways. Behind the visitor center is the Giant Logs Trail, which was another very cool place to see more petrified wood. It was probably my least favorite of the 3 hikes to see them, mainly because it was the busiest, and there were a handful of random wagons and things like that located around the trail. It's still worth your time, but it wasn't as immersive as the others, and if you have to skip one of these trails, I'd say this is the one you should pass on. Luckily, our final experience of the day would turn out to be a highlight, and that's the Long Logs Trail to Agate House. This is a 2.5-mile loop that you can reduce to less than 2 miles if you want to make it an out and back hike. That's what we did, and I thought it was a perfectly adequate amount of time to take in some of our last sightings of petrified wood. Plus, either way you get to see the Agate House, which is this small Pueblo building made up entirely of petrified wood. This originally 8-room structure has been dated to approximately the year 900, which is absolutely ridiculous. I literally don't even know what that means. What I do know is this was super cool and a great payoff to this hike. So in conclusion, what were my thoughts on Petrified Forest National Park? First and foremost, it became evident pretty early on that the scenery here was going to be much smaller scale than most national parks. Aside from its impressive diversity, I'd compare it mostly to a place like Joshua Tree, which similarly features small-scale scenery. I think I'd take it a bit over Joshua Tree, since as I said, the 3 distinct sections are very different from one another, but nothing about this park really blew me away. I definitely like the Blue Mesa and Petrified Forest sections quite a bit for what they are, but compared to everything else we saw on our road trip, it was one of the more forgettable places we visited. That said, I'm absolutely glad we made the several-hour detour to experience this park, as it was also very different from anywhere else on the trip. I completely understand why it was designated a national park, considering how rare and important some of these features are. But compared to all the others, it's definitely one of the weaker ones for me, and that's mainly because of the incredible competition it has. Let me know down in the comments what you think of Petrified Forest, and what part of the park looks most interesting to you. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a like, and subscribe to Travel Dash so you don't miss any content like this in the future. Until next time, I'll see you all very soon. Bye guys.